So I'm going to start with the standard ideas here that really are derived from empirical or quantitative type work of generalizability, validity, reliability, but I'll talk about those in the context of much more qualitative work. So first of all, generalizability. So this is just a reminder of issues I've talked about in several other modules. Generalizability is or at least in this case, looking at empirical generalization, the ability to go from a certain setting to other similar settings. So how justified is it in saying what you said about one, about the others? And in the case of empirical generalization, what you're claiming is that the setting you've examined, and very often when you're doing qualitative work, you've just looked at one setting, one context, one case, if you like, where people are. That setting is typical of many other similar settings. And, or it might be typical in the future. It's atypical now, but it's going to be what things are going to be in the future. Now, that claim for typicality depends upon certain things, like, for example, the homogeneity of settings. So you could argue all the settings are similar. So I've looked at the office in an insurance company, and all insurance company offices are going to be similar in this respect. You know, the way I've looked at it, they do similar things, they work under similar kinds of legal and marketing frameworks. But you need evidence for that. So at this stage, you may want to go sort of outside your project and make the case as to why your particular study is typical of this particular setting, this particular organisation, and so on, using statistics to show that, you know, the size and, you know, the turnover and things like that. Or maybe you're doing some kind of mixed method study with a bit of empirical or quantitative work along with the qualitative work, and you can bring that quantitative work in to show how typical things are. Or you might even have a multi-site approach where you're looking at different settings, so different sites, and you can then do that. So this is a very common approach in qualitative work to justify your generalization from your study to other similar settings. That's what you're saying. So empirically it's generalized. But you can also generalize in other ways. So you can generalize in terms of explanations, and that's what I've called this area here. So you're generalizing to a population showing the same explanatory features. In other words, the things that you've discovered, and I'll give an example here for kind of a medical setting. You might say that, you know, doctors typify patients. They have, you know, various types that they use to describe their patients. And that explains the doctor's attitudes. And we can say that other doctors with the same patient typifications may have the same attitudes. So if we find those same typifications happening in other settings, in other hospitals perhaps, in other countries, then we can say that the attitudes of doctors are going to be similarly reflected by those. So that's the explanation that you're giving in your work, and you're saying my explanation suggests that if I find similar things in other settings, they too will explain the attitudes that we find here and so on. So using that kind of logic to do it. However, be careful, as Alan Bryman points out, you've got to be very careful how you do that, try to avoid brief snippets or examples of conversation that are not enough to give the evidence for generalizability. So you've got to make sure that these explanations here are not just small scale and idiosyncratic, but are rather kind of well evidenced and well grounded, I guess, in your work. And then thirdly, you might generalize theoretically. So in this case, not the actual empirical relationships you're looking at, but rather the general theories you bring to bear, either to explain what you've gone or that you develop as part of your grounded work. But this is very contentious, and as a qualitative researcher, you might think that you don't think, actually, I'm not, you know, this kind of approach isn't really qualitative at all. Having a theory that's generalizable universally to all phenomena doesn't sound like a very qualitative approach at all. And as Hammersley points out, many people reject that kind of approach because, you know, qualitative work just doesn't do this kind of thing. It doesn't make grand theories of that kind. You know, for example, we assume that we've got some kind of ideal type in a kind of Weberian kind of sense. But how do we know that? How can we discover that ideal type? How can we, you know, validate it and so on? And ultimately, does it make this assumption that there are laws of behaviour that somehow explain things. And again, that's maybe something which, as qualitative researchers, we're very unhappy with. So it's one that's much more rarely used as a justification. Now, the very idea of generalizability is something which is criticised from a constructivist, a relativist point of view. And often that's recast as transferability. And I think that's very much the kind of idea captured by empirical generalization. What we're saying is, can we transfer our results to other similar settings? And we can do that by this kind of rich, detailed account of the sending setting, the setting we're familiar with, so that other settings, the receiving settings that we're trying to generalize to, can be seen to be similar in those respects. So it's very much a kind of an empirical generalization kind of account that we offer here. So many qualitative researchers follow this kind of justification for arguing that why their results are applicable outside the particular setting that they worked on. So that's the first of those big three things, generalization then. So next, reliability. Can we say the work is reliable? And again, this is a term that comes from a kind of quantitative, empiricist kind of approach. The idea is that something's reliable if the measures or the accounts you give the same answer in the same circumstances elsewhere. So if you do similar kinds of work, that's what you get. Notice it's not the same as validity. Something can be reliable but not valid. In other words, you can get the same consistent answers every time you do it, but it's just rubbish. It's whatever it is you're recording, it's not what's there. But it's consistently wrong, you could say. So reliability doesn't mean say anything about it right or wrong. It simply says we get the same thing every time we do it. And in the qualitative area, we normally try to ensure that reliability, that consistency, if you like, by documenting procedures, by making sure that others could do the same thing that we've done. So we document meticulously how we've done it and how we've drawn our conclusions. We can even use these field note conventions. I think I've mentioned those at this stage to show how you might kind of document your process. I've mentioned these kind of things before. Okay, so here's some ways of these little characters you can put into your field notes or even your general notes to indicate what's a verbatim quote, what's a paraphrase of what somebody said. And in particular, these two things here. What are emic concepts that you picked up that people in the field are using, that your respondents are using, the in vivo ideas, if you like, compared with your ideas, your theories, your explanations and so on, which would be the etic concepts. This emic etic is a very common distinction in ethnography, in anthropology, but you can use a similar kind of things in your notes. Other things we do here are inter-rater reliability issues to make sure that if you've got several people working on coding and so on, that they get similar results when they do the same kind of work. Now, if you're working on your own, it's very hard to get that, and you might want to ask somebody else to help you check, but it's very hard to get them to code in the same way. So this kind of thing really comes into its own in team projects where you've got several people working together. And there's a lot on it. So here's the kind of things we can do in inter-rater reliability or intercoder reliability. Just let's think through some of the issues involved here. We can start to say how reliable are we in actually assigning codes. I mean, it's thinking up codes, of bringing them together into the same kind of area. And you might have two researchers reading the text and developing codes quite different ways. With maybe overall a kind of general similarity because it's the same text, but the detail of how they do it could be quite different names for them, slightly different definitions and so on. There's the first difficult problem. And normally in a group project or a team project, you would have some early process where you decided upon the general coding scheme you're going to use, so that everyone then uses the same coding scheme. Then there's the issue of if you've got a single standard coding scheme, then you've got to apply it to the text. You've got to apply it to say this text is coded as so-and-so, that text is coded as so-and-so. If you think about it, that could be very easily very different. Even just one word could be a difference in terms of how you're coding. So what do you mean by being consistent? Does it mean consistent in terms of the general kind of number of words and which words are included, or is it down to the actual individual term and word they're using that makes a difference here? All kinds of issues come up about how you measure that reliability. There are, in fact, interestingly, I was on the web a couple of years ago, I came across this as a company, or it's actually a university spin-off company in the States that does this for you. It's actually a coding company. You can actually pay them to do your coding for you. Shouldn't be telling PhD students this, should I? That you can actually, you send off to this American company your data and your coding scheme. Or in fact, they'll help you develop the coding scheme as well if you want to. But you can do that, and then they have trained researchers who will go through and apply your code to the text. And they even have some software that helps them check it. They actually use Atlas TI software, and they have a plugin that helps them check whether this coding has been applied in the same way and how different. So they claim a high reliability in terms of coding. Now that's one view of what's involved here. Now many qualitative researchers would simply laugh at that and say, well, actually that rather defeats the point, isn't it really? The whole point about coding is to be much more creative about how you understand what's going on in the text. This is very a kind of empiricist kind of approach to check your coding scheme. And certainly you can see that if you look both at that particular company, its website, and other similar discussions, particularly in marketing research. You can see it's done from the point of view of kind of reassuring the empiricist-minded people that what you're doing is a reliable approach. So there's big debates about this kind of thing, inter-rater or inter-coder reliability on these things. However, you can use it constructively. So you could say, well, we're going to do it, but we're not going to rely on it we're going to use it as a mechanism for being clear about how we're coding. And certainly having discussions with people about how you code your things and what it means and so on. It's not a bad idea as a way of, furthering your analytic ideas about the text. So it's not entirely something that you want to reject if you're a constructivist. Okay, so that's reliability along with generalization. The third issue is validity. How can we make sure that what we're doing is valid? And this is probably the most contentious area for anyone who's of a constructivist or a relativist frame of mind. Because it depends upon this point that Hammersley makes here, that validity is truth interpreted as the extent to which an account accurately represents the social phenomena to which it refers. And of course that is what's contested by the constructivists, by the relativists and so on, who argue that there is no single truth that exists independently of the researcher and the society in which things are done and discussed and so on. So we can't ever talk about whether things accurately represent or not. Go on.
So if we were veering much more towards the constructionist perspective, and
yes.
We never mentioned validity in our thesis, but we mentioned or talked about it, as you say, with reliability, talked about transferability instead. Is that sort of a...
Generalization is reliability.
Yes.
Transferability,
yes.
Yeah.
Generalization.
Yeah.
So if you don't want to use these terms...
Yes. There are alternative terms here.
Yes.
I think I can't remember exactly now, but I think validity, the talk is about trustworthiness. And they often see that mentioned as an alternative way of thinking about it. Is this trustworthy? In other words, not that it's somehow valid because it's a true reflection of things, but can we trust the person who's saying it to come up with something that's, maybe useful or insightful or whatever. All sorts of other adjectives follow on from trustworthiness, I think.
But would people expect to see that I've decided not to, a sentence, I've decided not to use validity, but I'm using trustworthiness? Or, as blatantly as that? Or can you just sort of say that, or try and demonstrate?
I think if you're doing, it's harder in the case of master's dissertation because they're so short, but in a PhD, I would expect to see some discussion of your philosophical position anyway. in which you would spell out these things. And then the discussion later on of the quality of your analysis and your research work and so on should reflect your earlier philosophical position, I think. So that's how you put it. And you'd have then to discuss the ways in which you can give some assurance of trustworthiness. That's how you'd put it, if that's the approach you were taking. However, I think you can't escape it. I mean, my view, because you probably realise by now I'm somebody who sits on the fence here. I'm neither kind of take a very constructivist nor a very empiricist view of these things. I'm a mixed methods type of person, really. And I think you can't escape this, because even if you take a constructivist view of things, what you're saying is these people had this view about the world. And I can say, well, okay, yes, there may be other views. Maybe there's no absolute correct view of the world, accurate account, we can't talk about that. But is your summary, is your account of their view of the world valid? Is that accurate? In what way can we be reassured that you've done a good job in capturing their view of the world in your thesis, in your research, and so on? Now, I'm not going to, I think that's where you do come back to the trustworthiness idea, because you can't answer that by reference to some external phenomena that you can say it accurately captures that. No, that's not the case. But you do need to give an account of the validity of what you've done, that you are, in some sense, accurately kind of capturing what people have done. What I'm trying to do here is I'm not saying this is how you do it, but rather you have to think about these issues, and from your position you're taking, whatever it is, when you write up your work, you've then got to be consistent with how you do things, and that's what impresses people, that they can see that as works. Fielding and Fielding. This is Nigel Fielding and his wife Jane Fielding. Suggests we need to avoid two problems here in kind of the validity area. One is the tendency to select field data to fit an ideal conception. And these are, I suppose, when you are kind of giving your account, either for your validity or for your trustworthiness of your analysis, you've got to show that you're not doing that. You're not just picking out plumb kind of quotes that fit your preconception and missing out all the other things. This is where things like auditing comes in, because you can show you've been through things in a rigorous fashion, you haven't missed things out, and you haven't just picked on one or two cases and so on. In fact, they go even further and talk about this one here, the tendency to select field data that are conspicuous or exotic at the expense of less dramatic and possibly indicative data. It's what Silverman recalls selective anecdotalism. And we've all done this. It's all very, very tempting, I'm afraid. When you've done qualitative research, you often find one or two people are particularly good at expressing their ideas. And they use the kind of nice language that can really... It's often those that... I don't know if you've ever been tempted by this, but the chapter headings or even the title of the paper, often a quotation from somebody. And I've done it with work I've showed you here. So that study I did many years ago of unemployment in Kurt Lee's, what was it? I think I used it somewhere. The guy who thought he was too old, my age, at my age, and you can see that in quotes, being too old to get a job, that kind of thing. An article on that. And that's the temptation, is to pick those kinds of flowery examples, the selective anecdotalism. You've got to be sure, okay, it's good to select those, and I think I was justified, because actually there were quite a number of people that had the same problem about age and so on, and about finding work as they were older, in certain occupations particularly. So I could generalise it and show how it was an important subgroup to look at. But you have to make that effort to show that, because otherwise you can simply pick the exotic because it looks good in the write-up. Beware about that. So that again will affect the validity or the trustworthiness of what you're doing. Another often talked about concept here is triangulation. This is the idea of using multiple sources, multiple approaches, multiple methods to somehow to back up what you found from one of those sources or methods. And the idea is by seeing things from more than one perspective, you get a more rounded picture of things. And it's often suggested this addresses validity, that it's valid because we looked at it this way and that way, we got the same answers. And what's suggested here is probably okay for multiple sources, in qualitative work, you can interview people, you can observe them, and that's not a bad thing to do either. People say, when you interview them, I did this, I did that, I will do this, and so on. A nice way of checking that up, finding if it's valid or not, is to actually watch them and see whether they actually do those things that they said they would do. And of course, very typically, you find people don't always do what they say they would do. They are humans, after all. So that you can see how that works as a way of triangulating what's going on here. But it's been pointed out that probably multiple methods is not good here. If you do one method using qualitative, in-depth interviews and so on, and you come up with unset results, and then you do a survey, you come up with different results. What does that mean? Does it tell you that you've got to somehow reconcile the two, or is it telling you actually the methods are looking at different things, measuring different things, and so on? And actually, it's probably most likely the methods that are causing the difference rather than a difference in reality. So there's always a problem with that. So triangulation, yes, of this kind would be useful, but maybe not.
So interviews with some people and observation of others?
No, the same people, typically, if you can.
If you did interviews with some and observation of others, you would put that in the multiple methods?
No, I'd call that's one of these, but not very good.
Even if they're not the same people. So some people are saying we do this, but then when you go and look at practice generally somewhere else, that's actually not what happens.
What I mean is more the kind of long lines of combining qualitative and quantitative methods together. Yeah. Now, that's one of the, there's now an enormous literature on this. I don't know if you know about mixed methods and how it's grown, but it's a big growth area in research methods. Lots of text being published, lots of work being done on it. And one of the central issues it's concerned with is how do you bring together in a sensible way quantitative and qualitative approaches. So, how do you bring together surveys and experiments alongside interviews and observation, as the qualitative things. And it's not easy to do because you can fall foul of these kind of problems, that you get different answers, but what does that tell you? Does it tell you anything about the reality, or are those different answers simply reflecting the fact you've used different methods? And that's one of the kind of problems that mixed methods has to deal with, is how you reconcile those things. And you have to be quite careful about it, because otherwise it can just simply be the way you're measuring things that gives you different answers. Now, that's what I mean by that. Whereas here, I'm just simply saying it as a way of, within the same group, really, ideally, using different forms of qualitative approach to collect data about it. So I would call observation a qualitative approach, interviewing a qualitative approach, documents a qualitative approach, and so on. So I'm sticking within the qualitative, but using different kinds of approaches to get the data. That's how I see the difference here. So multiple methods is definitely kind of spanning across the qualitative-quantitative divide. Now, one area that's also become very popular here is respondent validation. I think I might have mentioned this in an earlier session talking about transcription and so on. It certainly has been used at the level of transcripts to make sure the transcription of documents is done accurately and correctly. But you can use it later on with your results of your work, with your analysis and any write-ups and reports you get from it. You can go back and ask the respondents whether that is a good reflection. It's very hard not to say accurate here, an accurate reflection, but is it a good reflection? Is it a trustworthy and fair reflection of what's gone on in their experience? And there's various ways of doing this. One typical way that has been done is using your own concepts to predict the respondent's description. So if you understand what's going on in the field so well, you can predict what they're going to say, then you're obviously onto something. You've got into their frame of mind sufficiently well that you know how they're going to behave. Or this idea of successful passing, that you know what's going on so well you can pass yourself off without their realising you're a researcher, not a whatever it is kind of person. You can be a gang member and they won't know you're not because you know how to do it properly. But most commonly, this approach relies upon asking members or respondents to judge the adequacy of the account. So you give them a copy of what you've done, your analysis or your report, and ask them to comment on it. So here's the strong version. They comment on the final research report. Or the weaker version, is something like an analytic stage, an earlier stage that you go through, such as some comment upon a transcript or something. And of course the problem comes if they disagree with you. What if they don't agree with what you've written? How do you deal with that? Well, you could go into the position of kind of re-interviewing them again and seeing where the differences are. Maybe that's a constructive way of doing things, because you might pull out new dimensions to understanding that you hadn't realised were there before. The fact they're disagreeing with what you think is happening suggests that maybe there are other things going on. So you kind of bring it as another stage of the analysis. So it is, in a sense, a kind of respondent validation that you're going on here, but I think you'll be careful how what kind of power you give to the respondents here. You don't want them to veto things completely. So here's various problems that crop up if you use this technique. The results that you produce need to be compatible with the self-image of participants, and if it's not, they might balk at it, and that's where they'll argue you've got it wrong. If you portray them as, something that's not very nice in their eyes, or in anybody's eyes perhaps, then they won't like it, and you've got to be careful about that. Gets agreement with what wasn't said and disagreement with what was said. Interestingly, people leave things out when they're saying things, and you as a researcher can identify those omissions as actually, very relevant to your work. And of course, when you show them the results, including the omissions, that's when you might get disagreements. You get an ambiguous response. A lot of people actually don't tell you that's wrong. They just feel very uneasy about it, or their disease shows through their expressions and so on. It's not quite right, but the reason for that is they can't lay their finger on it. They don't know what it is that's wrong. They just don't feel it's right. They can't say that particular thing's wrong, that particular thing's wrong. It's just the overall picture that's wrong. And it's very hard for you as a researcher to know what to do about that. So you've got to, that's a problem really. Friendly respondents, less likely to criticise, so the better you get on with respondents, the less likely they are to criticise you anyway, because they're being nice to you. What if you've asked these extreme questions? You get these kind of comments really from the respondents, like like it was as if you weren't even here. So beware of sarcasm almost. You'll get some quite strong responses from some respondents. And of course, it's difficult for respondents to agree if, particularly in an evaluation setting, your report might lead to all kinds of undesirable consequences for them, like their job goes or whatever. So they're hardly going to agree with you there, so beware of that. The weak version, actually is just looking at the process of analysis, avoids some of these problems. Obviously this applies mainly to the final report, the strong version. The weaker version, doing it at an earlier stage, perhaps is an easier one to handle. So I think, just to go back to that previous slide, I'm talking about this as quite a hard one to do, and maybe one to avoid. But this one is perhaps something more useful as a part of the process of getting some feedback from people. Okay, one or two other things that we might do to assure people that we're doing good quality work. And I've talked about several of these things already in the sessions on coding and grounded theory and so on. One of those is looking for negative cases. And this is, if you like, the heart of the fallibilistic approach. What happens if it's not that? What happens if something different is going on? What happens if they're not there, if they don't do this, and so on? And you ask those kind of questions when you're analysing the data. And if you like, beware of or be suspicious of research with no negative cases, where things never quite happen that way. And particularly when people say that, we don't do that, that never happens. That should immediately worry you. And if you kind of go back to the Campbell and Stanley stuff on quasi-experiments, you'll find a whole discussion of various kinds of threats to validity that can happen. So we do the same in qualitative work. Perikilo, I can't speak Finnish, but I don't know how you pronounce that one. Perikilo suggests three uses for deviant or negative cases. So when you're going through your work, you find one or two situations, one or two cases that don't fit the general theory you've come up with, or the general argument or general experience of people and so on. Well, first of all, you can use those negative cases as additional support for your conclusions because the people themselves recognise those as deviant cases. They're unusual. So, of course, you found one or two of them, but there are unusual, and everyone says they're unusual, and things don't normally happen like that. So it is consistent with their view of the world. Or you can take this kind of analytic induction approach to say, well, actually, remember that I went down that kind of that iterations of analytic deduction, that you kind of modify your hypotheses you go through. You could use it as a way of amending your ideas. As you find negative cases, you go back and modify your theory. Or what is most commonly done, actually, is this last one, which is you recognise the case is exceptional and you give the reasons, you explain why it's exceptional. So almost like taking on board these people's comments here, but explaining why they're saying it's not typical. So you can show for good reasons why this doesn't normally happen, but in some cases it has. So it doesn't undermine your whole approach, but rather it shows how in certain exceptional circumstances things don't work like that. So it's good to look for negative cases, it's good to kind of deal with them, and it's good to show where you have got them. You can then deal with them in one of these kind of three ways. One or two other ideas I've talked about before, the theoretical sampling from, this is kind of a grounded theory approach, Glaser and Strauss. And this idea of as your theory emerges, you find other cases that the theory suggests are going to make a difference. So if you've got, if your theory predicts that, for example, age is going to be an issue here, then you want to look for different age individuals and see whether it does make a difference here and talk to them. So you extend your sample on the theory that age will make a difference and so on. The question is, how do you know when to stop? And that's where Glaser and Strauss had this idea of theoretical saturation, that when you can't think of any other kind of dimensions and any other kind of issues that are going to make a difference, then you can stop because you've got theoretical saturation. I won't go over that again because I talked about that under the grounded theory. And of course, another idea from grounded theory is constant comparison. This idea of constantly comparing what you found with other similar things, with other similar cases, with other similar explanations that you've got. So I feel like this is a strategy for producing these thoroughly saturated theoretical counts. So you compare cases, incidents and so on, look for properties of those cases and compare the patterns to see whether similar kinds of things do or don't come out. So I'll give an example here at the end, doing that in a nursing setting. Again, I've covered this in a previous session, so I won't labour the point now. And that's really, I think, the crux of what I have to say today anyway about the quality of work. The best reference on this I've come across is Clive Seal's book, which is called The Quality of Qualitative Research, a whole book dedicated to these issues. But it's actually a very good, well-written kind of account, Clive Seal, talking about quality and qualitative research. Most of these issues come up in that book in various ways. But a lot of texts on qualitative work deal with this in passing. So these issues, of course, you can see how ideas from grounded theory come in here.